sense that they have kind of imported Western political ideas and integrated unknowingly, and they wouldn't admit it, into establishing an Islamic State. This is less the case with Islamic State, with ISIS. They would actually reject that kind of Western thing as foreign to Islam, because they are trying. What they are doing is they are returning to the original text. It comes out of the Salafist movement, which is going to the original text. Now, this is not to say that all Salafi Muslims are radicals, hardened radicals that are bent on jihad and conquering. The large majority of the Salafists are quietists, that you live a life as a Muslim, and you live the 5 pillars of prayer, charity. I used to know the 5 pillars: prayer, charity, fasting, Hajj, and there's one. And belief in the one God. Those are the 5 pillars of Islam. Belief in there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The second pillar is devotion, i.e. prayer. The third pillar is charity, and I think it's called zakar. That is an obligation on all Muslims. There's fasting, in other words, keeping the fast of Ramadan, and then the pilgrimage to Mecca and Hajj. Those are the 5 pillars. So, with this overview of these concepts in Islam, I'd like to kind of construct what is a Christian response, what is a Christian response to Islam. And this is where I'm not too optimistic about this. I kind of question myself if there actually is, quote unquote, a typical Christian response to Islam. Go back to my opening story about the Christians in Muslim Spain, and what they went through in resisting Islam and in responding to Islam. Many of them became martyrs. Martyrs for the faith. But the other problem to kind of eliciting a Christian response to Islam is, or to radical Islam in particular, is the problem of radical Islam itself, if it is a problem. If it is a problem, if radical Islam is a problem, it is a problem internal to Islam. We look kind of foolish saying, as Christians, as Westerners, as persons from the outside, saying that, well, radical Islam is not the true Islam. That's not the real Islam. Because that's what we've been saying all along. And there are certain moderate Muslims, particularly in this country, who kind of repeat that in different ways, that Islam is not about war. Islam is a religion of peace. It certainly is that within the realm of Islam. But yet that the seeds for that violent activism, as I have noted already, are embedded within the matrix of Islam itself. So this whole thing about radical Islam is something that Islam has to work out for itself in a certain way. We can't butt in, or we can't. If we butt in, we only complicate the problem. I mean, we can still help them arrive to that point. through interreligious dialogue. And I think this is a key to formulating a Christian response to Islam. But going back, to the fact that that principle of unity, that moral and political authority that Caliph had in Islam as the successor of the Prophet is gone. And it's not just because al-Baghdadi proclaims himself Caliph that he is Caliph. The loss of the Caliphate has created a huge problem for Islam because what little unifying principle there was in Islam lost a great blow with the abolition of the Caliphate. At least the Caliph had some sort of moral, religious, and political authority to draw the Muslims together. Maybe not the same kind of authority that we think of when we think of the Pope or the Patriarch in Istanbul, the Patriarch in Moscow, or the Archbishop of Canterbury. But he certainly, the Caliph certainly did have, at least in its early stages, a lot of authority. Mostly political, but also religious. So these inner tensions within Islam have to be solved by the Muslims themselves. Now, does that mean that we have to sit idly by? No. I think, as I mentioned earlier, interreligious dialogue, I think, is a key to our response to radical Islam. I'm usually rather skeptical about interreligious dialogue, mostly because the results I've seen have been, oh, we're all lovey-dovey, we all believe in the same God, this and that, and that's far from the truth. Our concept of God is certainly different from the Jewish concept of God, and it's definitely different from the Muslim concept of God. Even amongst Christians, while most mainstream Christians maintain belief in the Trinity, we still have the Unitarians out there. And concerning Buddhists and Eastern religions, it's a totally different kettle of fish. I mean, the Buddhist concept of divinity is radically different from our concept of divinity. We believe in a personal God. Buddhism divinity is kind of like this amorphous sea of divinity in which we empty ourselves into. Nonetheless, I think interreligious dialogue, when done properly, when we recognize our differences, can be a key in responding to radical Islam and helping Islam sort itself out. Because it is in the interreligious dialogue, one, that we know what our differences are, and two, that we can find common points of action. And I think the common point of action that we have is in the church's social teaching. Already in the recent past, the Catholic Church has kind of made common cause with many of the Muslim nations in some of these conferences on population, on women's rights, on children's rights, and a host of other topics, made common cause in opposing the Western humanist secularist agenda. And as basically through the church's social teaching that this alliance of convenience, if you want to call it, has happened. That while our social doctrine comes from a different point from Islam, there are common points. Ideas about society, common good, social welfare, family. And I think all this helps us to actually create a bridge with Islam, so that that allows Islam to have that internal dialogue within itself to figure out, well, what are we? Are we this? Are we going to reject this activist, almost Jacobin Bolshevik kind of form of Islam? Are we really a religion of peace? How are we going to live that out? How are we as Muslims going to live in a pluralistic society? I think that's something that they have to work that they have to work out, and we can help them work that out, given the fact that we live in this pluralistic society. And the points of contact are actually are right here among us. I think, you know, in the Middle East, it's a very homogeneous population. Culturally, people are, you know, large majority of people, with a few exceptions. But in the heart of the land of Islam, it's very homogeneous. Homogeneously Islamic. There are pockets of Christians here and there. There are pockets of Zoroastrians here and there. There are contacts with other minority religions that exist on the periphery. But here in the West, particularly in the United States, they are a minority religion. And they have to learn to live in a pluralistic society. And I think this is where some of the moderates are coming from. This is where some of the moderates say, no, we are a religion of peace. By and large, yes. By and large, yes. And they can live, you know, they can live in Western society just like any other religious group lives in Western society, alongside Buddhists, alongside Catholics, alongside Protestants, alongside Jews. And in fact, some of the radicalism, more so here in the United States, where we are accustomed to accepting people from the outside and integrating them into our society, than, say, in France or England, where they've kind of been held at arm's length. Well, we'll integrate you, but not so much. You know, we won't let you integrate so much, which is why they're having problems. Actually, more in Britain than in France. France gets the headlines, but the problems in Britain are much larger than they are in France. Because France has actually made a concerted effort to integrate them into French society. And what happened a few weeks ago in Paris with Charlie Hebdo, in some sense, has incensed even the Muslim population in France, saying that is not us. So, in conclusion, what I'd like to offer you is that there is a Christian response to radical Islam. And the response is to work with, to dialogue with the Muslims that are within our society, so we have a better understanding of each other. So we have a better understanding of our differences, of our common points. And that way we can work with the Muslims in order to build a truly just society, a truly pluralist society where we recognize our differences, where we recognize our commonalities, and yet we are able to work together towards a common goal in a proper secular society where people of all faiths are able to contribute to the common good and build society together. Thank you. I think I went a bit longer than I wanted to. I was hoping it was going to go shorter than I wanted to. But I believe we have time for questions. Yeah, so we can take a few questions. It's only 11 o'clock. We got nothing else to do for the rest of the day. Yes, quarterback.
Okay, so I read that Atlantic article, and I remember part of it was talking about how the belief in the Islamic State, the adherents to it, believe that Jesus is supposed to physically come back and lead a physical army of their army.
Yeah.
What is that one town in I think it's in North
I think it's something called Darbeek, if I remember correctly.
Yes, and how that is supposed to, he's supposed to fight the armies of Rome.
Right.
And one, I left the article thinking it was being very vague in terms of what the armies of Rome was. I mean, obviously you think of the Catholic Church, but it didn't necessarily point to that. And the other part of that is, as Catholics, as Christians, should we be more vocal, and should kind of the authority of the church be more vocal in terms of, no, this is not what Jesus is, not just to refute the Islamic perspective, but to say to the secular world, you know, this is not what we believe. You're hijacking our Savior, our God.
Right. Well, I think the references to the army of Rome and trying to explain it was deliberately vague, because the term itself, as used by al-Baghdadi, seems to be rather vague. Is something that Bernard Lewis points out is that from the perspective of Islam, when they look into the outside world, they don't see a bunch of nations. They see a whole bunch of infidels, people who are not Muslims. And they variously, characteristically, certainly if you look at the chronicles, the medieval chronicles of Muslims referring to the Christian West, they were invariably referred to us, if they refer to us in any kind of nationality, as either Romans or Franks. Romans being the Byzantines and the Franks being Western Europe. So if you go by that, you can see more or less the idea of this vague entity of the army of Rome as being basically the infidel West invading the heartland of Islam. In terms of Jesus, it's interesting that Jesus actually does appear in the Quran. The virgin birth is talked about in the Quran. You know, Mary gives birth to Jesus as a virgin because God wills it, not because of any kind of, you know, incarnation, immaculate conception kind of thing as we have speculated. But God willed that Jesus be born of a virgin. The sacrifice of Abraham is in the Quran. It's rather vague which son Abraham sacrifices, whether it's Isaac or if it's Ismail, and because of polemics with the Jews, the Muslim scholars have fallen on the side that the son is Ismail, not Isaac. The second holiest place in Islam, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, is built on the site that tradition has it, is where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son, and is where the Holy of Holies of the Solomon Temple is supposed to be located, saying to the Jews that we have superseded your covenant. Islam has superseded Judaism. So the thing is, Muslims approach Christianity with already a whole set of preconceptions that are in the holy texts and the tradition that we don't have of Islam. mostly because Islam comes after Christianity. And while they recognize Jews and Christians as quote-unquote people of the book, and they have some part of revelation, they state quite clearly that the Jews have falsified revelation for their own ends, that they twisted the revelation given to Moses, so everything after Moses is, and that Christians are filled with false doctrines, such as the Incarnation, such as the Trinity. So that's part of it. That's now, and I can't remember what the second part of your question was.
Well, I guess my question was, but should the Catholic Church, should Christians in general be more vocal about saying to the world the Muslim conception of who Christ is incorrect? That there is this physical Christ who's going to come back and lead the Islamic State army to fight the armies of Rome, those kinds of issues.
Well, that kind of eschatological expectation. Well, certainly we should be at least clear in interreligious dialogue about what our beliefs about Jesus Christ are, knowing full well that we're not going to come to a conclusion. That this is a stark difference between Islam and Christianity that cannot be reconciled. Yeah, I mean, the only way it can be reconciled, if that is a reconciliation, is that one religion takes over and supersedes the other, whether it be one or the other. Yes, or I'm trying to get all sides of the room here.
Regarding dialogue.
Yes.
Okay. I have a very good friend of mine that retired from Justice Department, and he did a lot of things throughout the world that he cannot talk about. But one of the things he told me is the difficulty in dialoguing with Islam, with Muslims, is by the Quran they are trained to lie to infidels. And our whole system is based on truth. So I have a real difficulty trying to figure out how we are going to effectively dialogue when you can't believe what's coming back at you. And maybe that concept is wrong. If you would comment.
I don't think it's wrong. I've heard of that concept, it does present difficulties. It does present difficulties that that if they're entering into dialogue with ill will, with bad faith, then what's the point of dialoguing? I can't pretend to know what's in the hearts and minds of the people entering that dialogue, but I still think that a true dialogue between Islam and Christianity, both parties will be coming in good faith, not trying to convert the other, but in working out and knowing what our differences are and finding points of commonality. Again, that depends on the partners with whom we are dialoguing. I think there are Muslims out there of the more pious and quietist tradition that are willing to enter into a dialogue. Not necessarily Salafists, but certainly more moderate parties who want to enter into an earnest and fruitful dialogue with all the religions, because particularly in Western countries, because I think they're, I don't want to say they're survival, but they're, the comity, the cohabitation with them depends on it. Because otherwise we enter into basically one jihad against another jihad. We either going through a jihad that expands Islam, or we're going through a reconquista that reconquers militarily the lands lost by Christianity, as in Spain, as in the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries. Yes.
And we may be thinking that way, but I really don't think they're thinking that way. And I mean, I also have a big problem with a religion that is mainly political. I mean, if Muhammad's original intent was what it is, you know, and Jesus is like, my kingdom is not of this world, but really their kingdom is of this world. The religion aspect of the Muslims, I find difficult to grasp. I know you explained it, but I have a hard time really believing that with all the emphasis on blind obedience and you know, not, you know, the way that they're taught in their religion, I find it hard to believe that if they're told to do something, and if the Muslims are getting together to whatever, that they wouldn't just follow along, just because it's the nature of their religion from the way you explained it in the beginning. So I don't know. I don't have a lot of hope for interfaith dialogue, just because I think our faith is so deep and so true, and theirs really isn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even if they want to say that it is and believe that it is, it's not.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I personally am skeptical about interreligious dialogue, only because of what the goals of what we want the goals of interreligious dialogue to be. I mean, like I said earlier, you know, we have two religions that have universal claims on the truth, and they're bound to clash. We certainly, as Catholics, believe that that Christianity, that Catholicism, is the true religion. That we have the ultimate, we have the true revelation of who God is. We have it from God's Son. And there's nothing that's going to convince me otherwise. But I think we have to clarify what the nature of interreligious dialogue is.
But even from the study of who Muhammad was, I can't really. I mean, I'm like, what?
Well,
their religion is based on.
I'm trying to be as optimistic as I can about this whole thing. I can assure you, I know a couple of brothers who are not as optimistic, or do not even want to be as optimistic as I am, and they will remain nameless because they might get in trouble, and I might get in trouble, but for different reasons. But yes, I mean the whole political part of Islam, I think, is a barrier. It is a huge barrier to any kind of dialogue with Islam, particularly today, particularly when some sections of the Muslim world have been so radicalized, have been so Jacobinized, if that's a word. And that's a historical political question. That in some ways, to some degree, is a consequence of colonialism, of what happened in the Middle East after World War II, after World War I, excuse me. And the bankruptcy of Arab nationalism and Pan-Arabism in the post-World War II, post-colonial period. But that political see, we're working from concepts that are a result of our own history, and part of that concept, and that concept is in our sacred texts to a certain extent, is the separation of church and state, as we call today's separation of church and state, which has taken various meanings over the centuries of development in Christianity. At the height of, in the high Middle Ages, at the height of papal power, the separation of church and state meant that the Pope stood over Christian sovereigns and could make and break kings, such as with the excommunication of King John around 1200 in England. So that's, I think that's a barrier for us. But it's a barrier for them because they're coming from a totally different history in which the land of Islam was this integrated polity, this community of fellow believers that had a leader in the caliph, that commanded a certain obedience, that created a certain civilization, and it was a very high civilization compared to what the Middle Ages was in Western Europe. I mean, you know, the Dark Ages were the Dark Ages for a very real reason. So I understand where you're coming from, but I still think a proper dialogue that in which the partners recognize each other as equals and recognize the differences between each other will still bear fruit in the sense that we will find common points of action to live in order to live in a pluralistic society. Yes, over here.
If there's no leader per se, and it's only might makes right, how can the Muslims take back their faith and coexist with anybody else? Or is their faith not to coexist?
Yes.
Okay, let's put on my diplomacy hat here.
Not to be diplomatic. This is like a meeting.
Well,
We don't.
well, I mean, to put it bluntly, that's something that we can't answer. That's something for the Muslims themselves. They have to answer for themselves for that. They have to come together. They have to find a way of coming up with common doctrine. They have to find a way of being able to move forward together and find and define for themselves what the Quran says, what is God's will, and how do we live it. In a sense, there is a sense that Islam is an all or nothing religion. Yes, that's true. And there is a sense where Islam cannot coexist.
Right. If they have the power, they will make.
Or at least, and this is what Graham Wood points out at the end of his article. At least a certain vision of Islam cannot coexist with other nations. It is in a world in a globalized world that it will sit isolated from all the other nations It cannot, a vision of Islam that says that even voting for a leader is a sin. They cannot have ambassadors. They cannot have a representative in the UN. So, in a sense, but that kind of, what Graham Woods points out, that kind of Islam, totally isolated from the rest of the world, in a globalized world, would collapse upon itself, eventually. Maybe not immediately, but living in that total isolation would collapse upon itself. So it is incumbent upon Muslims themselves that they have to work this out. But whether they come up with a single leader or not, I don't know. I cannot speculate on how they're going to do that. Yes.
In order to have dialogue, it takes two to tango.
Exactly. Yes.
Who are you going to? They have no leader. Who are you going to
Well,
talk
that's-
to? So
there are still leaders in the community, and interreligious dialogue does happen amongst local community leaders. You know, we do have, I live in Washington, D.C., and in the D.C. area we have an interfaith council where leaders of the different religious communities come together. And they put on events together, they put meetings together amongst the different pastors and ministers and religious community leaders. So it can still happen, at least on a local basis. How that filters out to the wider Islamic community, I have no idea. But I think it has to happen. It has to happen. There are certain authorities in the Muslim world that actually command that kind of at least moral authority, or used to it at some point in time, like the academics at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, or certain muftis, important muftis that are placed in different parts of the Islamic world. So there might not be one single authority, but I think there are enough of them that carry enough weight so as to at least have that dialogue. Yes, back there.
Yeah, just an observation. I mean, we're talking about having sort of that single point of contact, but if you think about other challenges, and I'll use the term radical secularism, there's no real leader to that. And that's something that we're in tension with as Christians on a day-to-day basis. We still have opportunities for dialogue. I mean, change can be promulgated sort of from a grassroots perspective. You don't necessarily have to, have that single point of contact to
I agree.
change.
Yeah. I agree totally with that assessment. You don't have to have a single point. Having a single point of contact itself would be detrimental. I think you have to have various points of contacts at various levels, both at the level of grassroots within the community and within the larger body politic. Way in the back.
Way in the back. I just mentioned I think the answer myself, and everything you said, I agree. Dialogue as human beings, but on the spiritual end, I think the Holy Father and the Bishop have got to call Catholics back to fasting, praying, doing penance, reform our life. Jonah knew that when he went to Nineveh, right? He knew, reading it, if those people did that, God would forgive them, and would not only forgive them, but use them to chastise his people.
Well, we do that every year.
But
on Ash Wednesday, if you've read the Gospel, it's a call to penance, fast, and prayer, and charity. And we don't need the bishops to do that for us. We have the Holy Liturgy that does that for us.
Yeah, but I think they have to understand. I mean, that was Our Lady's message to Fatima.
Yeah.
She outright told them if we would do that, there would never have been a Second World War. Now, from the human mind, we can't believe that.
I think this is well and good. these are things that we all have to be reminded of periodically as part of our Christian Western heritage. And I think that kind of concept, you know, the gospel that we read on Ash Wednesday that talks about almsgiving, prayer, almsgiving, fasting, and prayer, so works of charity, you know, depriving yourself of something of some material good for greater spiritual contact, and prayer and devotion. I mean, that's right up there with the 5 pillars of Islam. That's a point of contact. That's something that we can use to create a dialogue.
And it's great, but Catholics aren't doing it.
Well, that's a matter of personal practice. I'm sure. You know, I knew a lot in college. I had a lot of contact with Muslims in college, mostly from North Africa, and they were very, very secular. They drank and smoked. They didn't observe Ramadan. I mean, they need to be reminded if they truly are believing, practicing Muslims.
Well, I'm glad they're not doing it. That's a start for it.
I will say this. I will say this. And it struck me because we think of Ramadan as a period of fasting, but the fasting is only from sunrise to sunset. And one of my Moroccan classmates says, "Yeah, Ramadan is the time of year where they waste the most food because you can't eat anything during the day, but at night you party all day. You party all night long." Yes, over here.
Yes, you mentioned that Islam, radical Islam, is that the Muslims have to resolve this within
Yeah.
themselves. However, I found with dialogue with other Muslims that they don't feel they are separating themselves from this radical Islam and what's going on with ISIS over in the Middle East. Okay, so they're not really associating, they're saying that's not us, that's not what Muslims are, and that's really pretty much the United States moderate Muslims that we work with and we see at the store and things like that. Okay, so how do we basically respond to them when they say, well, that's not us? Okay,
Well,
but yet it
yeah.
is them, as you
Well,
pointed out.
denial is not a river in Egypt. I think there is and we do it too. We do it too with our own radical elements in our society. The whole idea of domestic terrorism, Christmas base of the world. That's not us. That's not who we are, and we all do that. And I think I think saying that radical Islam, on the part of Muslims saying that radical Islam, that's not us. That's I won't say that flies in the face of reality. I will say that it is not recognizing the reality that is out there, because these radical Islam, what ISIS is saying, on all the sermons we hear from these religious leaders, they're doing nothing but quoting the Quran. They're doing nothing than exhorting the people to live an Islamic life. They're doing nothing more than, it is a very literalist interpretation of what is in the Quran. And it is fueled with a lot of eschatological, apocalyptic elements in it. Just like Christianity has that eschatological, apocalyptic element to it. And there are Christian groups that live that way. All you have to look is what happened in Waco, Texas. What is that? 20 years ago now, I think. So they can say, the moderate Muslims in this country can say all they want, that's not us. That's not us. Well, maybe it is not you, but you still have to deal with it. Just to say that that's not us, that's not the real Islam. That's not dealing with the problem. That's kicking the can down the road.
Are they doing anything about it?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Up here in front.
Archbishop Sheen, in his book, The World's First Law, has a chapter on marrying in the Quran. And he's saying, and it was 50 years ago, that he could see those statesmen didn't recognize it yet, that Islam was growing strong again, and that he felt Mary, because they in the Quran recognize our Blessed Mother as the most perfect woman and have some respect for her, that Mary would be our intercessor for, how would we word it, conversion of the Muslims, or I don't know.
She is certainly a point of contact between Islam and Christianity, clearly. And even our own, our own Dominican order recognized that when we created the province of Pakistan, where many men from my province were missionaries, and it was the province of Mary, Maria, province of the Son of Mary. So it is a point of contact for dialogue. It is a point of contact for evangelization, to the extent that we can evangelize Islam to the Muslims.